Good afternoon. Welcome to our quick interactive module. My name is Sean Ghazala. I am the TYSA coordinator at the Staten Island Partnership for Community Wellness. I am joined by our coalition partner, my colleague, Ann DeMarzo. Ann, hi, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for inviting me here to do this talk on what I've learned through my journey of change. My name is Ann DeMarzo. I am the parent of a person who suffers with substance use disorder. I work on the community messaging group with TYSA, and I'm also a trained SMART recovery facilitator. SMART is a global science-informed mutual aid organization. So what I've learned down to one little nut is that there are specific things we can do to influence positive change.
That's great. Well, so what's the first thing that we should know about change?
Well, it's a process, especially with behavioral change. It happens over time.
And what do we know about the process?
Well, science has a model for this. It's a model called the stages of change. And there are 5 stages. A person can enter or exit at any time, come back in, go back out, but change doesn't usually happen spontaneously. So the 5 stages would be pre-contemplative, and that's where the person who might have some unhealthy behavior doesn't even think it's a problem. It's working for them, it's serving them. Then something might happen and they decide maybe they do need a change, and that would be contemplative. So something happened like they empty their bank account, or their wife asked for a divorce or something like that. So they might think about change. Then there's the preparation stage where they gather resources and they make a plan. And then comes action. They actually put it into action. And they look and see what's working, what isn't working, and make adjustments. And finally, there's the maintenance stage where the new way of the change has become a part of their life, and they just need to keep filling in the old habits with healthy habits, because we do create a void when we stop doing something, so we need to put in something healthy.
And change is an important part of our lives, but why is it helpful that we understand this process?
Well, when we know that it is a process, we can gauge where our loved one is at, where we're at. We can be more compassionate to ourselves and our loved one. And we can set more realistic expectations. And that way we can stay supportive.
That's great. So what does it take to get this process started?
There are usually 3 elements to get it jump started, and that would include it has to be important to the person who's going to make the change. It doesn't have to be so much important to us as it does to them. They also have to be ready. Is their behavior still serving them, or do they have enough motivation, enough reason to move away from it? And then they have to feel confident. They might have failed before, and now they have support. So they're more confident and they can begin the process.
Great. So what are the 10 ways that we can promote positive change?
Glad you asked. It was a long journey, and the very first thing is to practice self-care. And you'll notice a lot of these points that I make, I always preface it with the word practice, because this isn't something that comes natural. Change is hard, and it's a long process, especially in the context of addiction recovery. So self-care, when we take care of ourselves, we have the energy to go the distance. We can think more clearly, and we can remain compassionate.
That's great. So I've heard people say that they feel that self-care is selfish. How would you respond to that?
I've heard that as well. And I totally get it. I mean, when your loved one is suffering, you're not really thinking about yourself. But, I would say, think of it this way. It's a generous act of protecting your loved one's greatest resource. It's important.
Okay, so what's next for us?
All right, so the next one would be to practice non-confrontational interaction. Now, change requires motivation, and confrontation is a motivational killer. So we know that addiction is not a moral failing, it's a medical condition. And we know that compassion works. So we want to try to be non confrontational. And I know that's difficult to be empathic when somebody is really being annoying or doing something really scary. But our loved one matters. So we do it
So it sounds like we need a certain level of acceptance.
for sure. And that would also include the next element of positive change, and that's practicing non judgmental conversation. Uh, it's not easy. Their behaviors make sense, at least in the short term. But when we practice non confrontational conversation, we create a safe space for them and it gives them a chance to figure things out.
So how do we move from here?
Okay, so we're non-judgmental, we're non-confrontational. So now we're going to speak to our loved one as we go along, and that's going to be positive communication. This is an important skill. And there are some basics to know about communication. They require some level of fairness. So be prepared for some give and take. We need to consider their needs as well as our own. It's helpful to acknowledge when we're wrong, and timing is important. So it's good to ask permission before you start a conversation. And also, you might tell your loved one that it can be a listening session. Nothing has to be decided right then. You come back, you revisit it. And so, conversation is not just speaking, it's also listening. And listening, isn't about convincing the other person, it's about understanding what they're trying to say. And it gives people a chance to tease out what they're thinking, because sometimes they'll come back and say, that's not really what I meant. So when we're just listening and we're reflecting back, it's really healthy. It's good to be open-minded. People will say things that you don't quite get, but when you're open-minded, you might come to a new understanding. So you're making progress, you're moving forward. um, Speaking with a tone of humility is important, because a lot of times our answer is not the answer. The other person is trying to work on something and we're not quite in tune to it. So, listen with humility, and also to take a time out if things get heated.
Well, you mentioned tone, and I think that's important. I wondered if maybe you could tell us a little bit more about, speak a little bit more about that.
Sure. So at SMART, we talk about planning our conversations, and we use an acronym to guide us. It's called PIUS. And the P in pious reminds us to start with something positive. And that disarms the listener. They don't get all defensive. It reminds both of us that there are things to appreciate about each other. The I would be use I statements. Take responsibility for your own feelings. You don't put it on the other person. You made me feel blah, blah, you know. So I feel concerned, and that's all on me. And then the U is for understanding. Try to look at the situation through your loved one's eyes. And S is sharing responsibility. So when we do that, we break the pattern of conflict. How can I help?
So are you entering a conversation with the script ready?
Not exactly. Especially early on, we advise that people plan out using these elements, but they kind of just get etched on your brain. And when you go into the conversation, hopefully you'll include uh, more of them. 3 out of 4 would be great. Um, uh, let's give you an example. Say you're concerned about a loved one. Your 16-year-old is staying in their room far too much on their computer. And so you plan with Pius, and at a good time, you would say to them, I really love being in your company. And I know this pandemic has put a lot of limitations on all of us, but I'm feeling concerned about your spending so much time alone and being so physically inactive. I know that I haven't been the best example, but how about we take a walk a few nights a week? Would you be willing to do that? So just be brief and stay on point. And your loved one may say no, but this is the way we set the example to include ourselves in the problem and the solution, and we get to become their ally.
I love that. Um, you had mentioned earlier that one of the ways to promote positive change is underrated. Could you tell us more about that?
Sure. I can't believe it took me so long to get that one, but it's positive reinforcement. It's very powerful, and it's about behavior strengthening. So when we recognize behavior we do want to see, people tend to do more of it. It's a form of reward, and sustained change is driven by reward. And it can be as simple as a smile or something more. Um, it is underrated, but probably because it's very difficult. When someone is behaving in an undesirable way, it can leave us feeling pretty unkind, but the payoff is big. So, an example would be your loved one is doing things that they're not very proud of. So, lying becomes part of the relationship. So, if you should catch them with any attempt of trying to be honest, telling the truth, you could say, I know that wasn't easy to admit. Thank you for being honest. So, when we notice that, people feel a desire to change. So, and I'll finish this part with a quote on overcoming resistance, and it's by Dr. Javier Amador, and he says, "You don't win on the strength of your argument. You win on the strength of your relationship."
Yeah, that's great. So families want to help, of course, but how can they do that without enabling their loved one?
Yeah, not my favorite word, enabling, because I think it's very natural to enable success in relationships, and but when it comes to addiction, that can be exploited. So, and a way to recognize that this is happening is we feel anger, we feel frustrated, we feel hopeless. That usually means there's weak boundaries. So, an easy thing to do would be just to detach with love. But considering the potency for today's street drugs, that can bring us to a place of no return. So, no one needs to hit rock bottom.
So how do we stay connected to them and avoid that?
Okay, so learning how to establish healthy boundaries. And I don't know, that might seem difficult, but if you keep in mind that our trust, affection, our time, our energy, our friendship has value to our loved one. So when we enforce boundaries, we actually provide them a good reason to change.
So how do we decide on what a boundary should be?
A simple rule for that would just be to ask yourself, what's permissible for me? How rigid or flexible it should be is the hard part, especially when relationships become unhealthy. If you have a healthy relationship, you can talk to the other person, but in an unhealthy relationship, you're kind of on your own.
So what is your suggestion?
At Smart, we discuss healthy boundary beliefs that we've adopted from James Messina, Dr. James Messina. And they're basically a personal bill of rights that helps an individual determine what's reasonable to ask for. And if you read them every day, you start to internalize them and feel, yeah, I have a right to be, to feel safe in my home, to be happy. It's a great document.
Great, and we'll include that resource in the description below. But what's a good way to establish this healthy boundary with our loved one?
Okay, so again, when in change, we're learning new things. We're learning life skills, and boundaries shouldn't sound accusatory. You just state them concisely and in a calm tone. Um, for example, you would say to your loved one, "When you do some behavior, I feel somehow. Can I ask you to stop doing that?" Or maybe you could say, "I need you to do this." And just remember that you have a right to your personal preferences, and your loved one has a right to honor it or not. So if the boundary is disregarded, the first thing you would do is just to repeat it matter of factly, maybe one or two more times. And then if it continues to be disregarded, we're obligated to take a protective action. And that would sound like, "I've asked you several times not to do that. Now I need to X." And that should be relevant. It shouldn't be just an arbitrary punishment. Say, for example, your loved one repeatedly leaves a dirty cereal bowl in their bedroom. You can stop buying their favorite cereal. Another example is when we basically force them to reestablish trust before we start to go back to doing a favor we always did for them.
So something relevant might be tricky to come up with on the fly then, right?
It is. It is. Because you plan one conversation and the next thing happens 5 minutes later. So it's really tough. But um, just let them know you need to think about it. And, follow through shortly after. And remember that temporarily disengaging is often good enough to get the message across.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. We want to be very deliberate about it. So can you explain the difference between punishment on the one hand and protective action?
I'm glad you asked, because punishment does backfire. And that's just a random cost that we impose on another person, where a protective action serves as a guardrail. It helps our loved one make the connection between their own choices and the consequences that follow. So, this brings us to the next element of positive change, and that's appreciating natural consequences. What I mean by natural is what happens as a result of the person's own choice. And what I mean by appreciate is the world becomes their teacher, and we get to maintain our positive influence. And this also translates into a vote of confidence and gives them a shot at working something out on their own. But I will offer, important caveat that consequences need to be safe to allow. Again, in today's drug climate, it can be really hard to know. So I implore our viewers, when you see a consequence that you can allow, take advantage of it.
So you've given us some helpful ideas for breaking these old patterns, but are there ways we can help our loved one find new ways of being?
Yes, yeah, we've been speaking about ways to improve the relationship, and by practicing this mutual respect, everyone realizes a degree of personal power, and this nurtures a willingness to collaborate. And that opens the possibility of brainstorming, which is the next element. When we collaborate together, that's key. So brainstorming.
And could you tell us a little bit more about what brainstorming looks like?
Yeah, I guess a lot of people have done it now and again, but I'll go over it because it's important to remember that you're trying to uncover workable ideas, and you're in a new situation, and it's tough. So you define a specific goal, and you anticipate some obstacles and make revisions. But the first thing you're going to do is come up with a bunch of ideas, and no suggestion is dismissed. Nothing is too wild. As we have that slide there with the Wright brothers. Everybody thought they were foolish. And so after we generate a bunch of ideas and we've exhausted that process, we would group them into themes and just look them over and throw out the ones that are totally ridiculous, look for something that might be useful and build on it. And now you're ready to come up with some options to try. And I recommend that you set a time to come back to it, because you don't want to be locked into something that isn't working. So maybe you could say, we'll come back and make adjustments in 2 days, 2 weeks, whatever, and then try again. So coincidentally, that brings us to offer a variety of options. That people are individuals and circumstances are unique. So what works for one person may not work for the other person. And your loved one's preferences matter. And what I'm talking about here specifically is if the change we're looking for is about choosing recovery. So we have to focus on what's important to our loved ones and address any barriers. Do they have insurance? Do they not have insurance? Do they have work or family obligations? Do they want intensive treatment or just a group therapy or just peer support, whatever. So you come up with a bunch of options. And when they're seem receptive to change, you can have that conversation. So have those options ready. So collaboration empowers people, but providing options invites people to buy into the solution. So then the last way to change is when any of us try something new, it takes practice to get it right. Not only for the person who's trying to change, but also us as the supporting backup. I mean, we make mistakes and we can say, I'm sorry, can we do that over? I got that wrong. So with patience, practice, persistence, positive change becomes part of life.
Well, thank you, Anne, for going over the 10 ways to promote positive change. Thank you for all the work you're doing in the community for our family and friends in recovery. And if you would like to connect with the TYSA Coalition or Smart Recovery Family and Friends, we have our contact information on the screen. We'll also have it in the description below. We're available by email, on social media. You can call us. And any closing remarks?
Sure, I'll add that on Saturday mornings, I facilitate a smart recovery meeting for family and friends where people can refine these skills, and there's so many more, get the support of other people going through the same thing. Our meetings are Saturday mornings, 10:30 to noon. And if you go on to smartrecovery.org or email me or phone me, I can hook you up with the local link. So thank you everybody for viewing, and Sean, thank you so much for inviting me to do this.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks for all you're doing for the community.
Thanks.